the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share some thoughts about intermediate moves and defensive moves. Let's get to our first example. Here we go. In this position, it is Black's turn, and there is an obvious looking move that seems to win material right away. So the first thing is to acknowledge what is in the position, who is ahead in material, and what tactical possibilities there may be. In this situation, we can see that there is a complete material balance, each side having a queen, two rooks, a bishop, and two knights, and equal number of pawns. So everything is equal on the material stand. And it seems that Black can win an exchange by making this fork on White's queen and rook. However, then we should notice that the White queen is able to move away by checking Black's king. And then, whether the Black king moves or Black blocks the check with a knight, the rook is free to run away as well. So, the moral of the story, Black's bishop d3 move does not result in any kind of gain for Black. Let's move on to our next example. That's a rook and bishop versus rook and knight endgame with equal number of pawns. Let's try to evaluate the situation. As we said, in material it's even. However, strategically, Black has a significant advantage in that the Black knight from g6 is about to centralize itself and jump to e5, where it will have an excellent outpost from where it cannot be chased out. Such type of outposts can be really powerful, especially when it cannot be chased by a pawn from either side, because White no longer has a d or f pawn, and neither can it be attacked by any of the other White pieces. Moreover, the White bishop on d3, as I like to call it sometimes, looks like a tall, grown pawn, because it's not much more useful than if it was a pawn. However, White may try a tactical option that at first seems pretty good. White can try to advance the e-pawn from e4 to e5. What happens now is not only that the White pawn from e5 attacks Black's rook, but at the same time White created a discovery attacking the Black knight. A very important advice: always look out for your opponent's best moves as well, not just of your own. Right now, if Black would capture the pawn with a pawn and protect the knight with the rook at the same time, White would gain the pawn back by giving a check and then capturing the pawn on g7, and all of a sudden the White bishop has been activated because White no longer has that pawn on e4 that actually limits the mobility of White's bishop. This is not the problem. The problem is that after White would play e5, Black can capture that pawn with a knight as well, and at the same time jump away from that hanging square on g6. Now, all White had achieved is lost a pawn. So no matter what, in the starting position, doesn't matter how White continues, Black has a substantial advantage. Of course, e5 would just make things worse because it would give up on a pawn immediately. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, it is Black's turn, and White has just offered the exchange of queens. Generally speaking, when you're having an attack or a safer king position, you would want to avoid the exchange of queens. As we know, queens are the most powerful and dangerous attacking pieces. So therefore, just out of instinct, I would move my queen probably to b6, creating some kind of threat with queen g1 and making sure that the queens remain on the board. However, at the same time, we always need to look out for tactical opportunities as well. And you may notice that by trading queens on e2 and then follow it up with bishop h5 check, you may create a skewer. And again, the important message is make sure you don't only look for your own good moves, but also of your opponent's. And in this case, if you wouldn't do so, then you may choose the inferior path instead of keeping the queens on the board. So, as I said, I would move the queen, wouldn't trade, but if you would, the problem is after this check, white can block it and be safe. This would be clearly inferior than keeping the queens on the board. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn. Right now, there is material balance, but it's black's turn, and black can obviously win material right away. In fact, it seems that there are two different ways that can win material. It's only on rare occasions in chess when you have two equally good moves. Generally, you have a best move and then a second or third best. First thing is to understand what your options are. Well, there is a very natural option, namely to capture white's rook on d1. And then you may notice an even more appealing one, creating a pin by moving your rook to f7. Again, it's important to recognize what your opponent's best choices are. Try to take a couple of minutes and make your choice. Would you capture the rook on d1, or is it even better to create a pin with rook f7? In this situation, the answer is rook f7 would be a mistake. Because while it seems that now the white queen is pinned and in trouble, the reality is that white can create a counter pin. And all of a sudden, the black rook is unable to capture the white queen because it is in an absolute pin. On the other hand, after rook takes rook and queen takes rook, white has nothing to worry about. So therefore, we left with the correct answer with a simple rook takes rook. Black doesn't have to worry here about any perpetual checks, because after the first check with queen e5, black can put an end to that by giving a counter check, blocking it with queen f6, forcing white to exchange queens, resulting in an easily won endgame for black with an extra rook. Let's see the next example. Here we go. Lots of pieces on the board. It's still the beginning of the game. In this position, black is at the moment one pawn up, but white has the opportunity to immediately regain that pawn with queen takes on e4. Right now, black has numerous options, among them capturing the pawn on e5. And indeed, queen captures e5 is black's best choice. However, if you like tactics, you may have noticed another tempting opportunity, namely to play c6 to c5, create a discovered attack on the white queen on e4 and simultaneously the knight on d4. Again, unless you see the best moves for your opponent, you may choose the wrong move, which is, in this case, playing c5. One of the typical methods to get away from a double attack is if one of your attacked pieces moves away and attacks an equally valuable or more valuable piece of the opposite color. That's the case here when the white knight is able to jump away to b5. So if now bishop takes queen on e4, then white knight takes on c7, not only winning the queen but immediately creating a fork on black's king and rook. On the other hand, if the black queen would capture on e5, that would not be a great idea in this case, because the bishop on b7 would be unprotected. After queen e4, c5, knight b5, a better choice is to move the queen back to b8, hanging on to the bishop on b7, but then white would still have a pretty nice game after playing queen g4 and immediately questioning the pawn on g7. And now if queen takes e5, then white plays bishop f4, followed by the fork with knight c7, giving white a winning advantage. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this endgame, white seems to be doing better, although there is a material balance. White has an extra rook versus black having an extra bishop and 2 pawns, which theoretically is even. Practically speaking, black's pieces are kind of discoordinated, meaning the black rook cannot get to an open file anytime soon. Also, the black king is still stuck in the middle of the board, and even though most of the pieces are gone, it can still get into trouble, as we shall see. The other problem that black faces is that the pawn on a6 can become a target pretty soon to be attacked by one of white's rooks. In this position, black has a very obvious looking move, namely to create a pin with bishop d4. And again, I can't stress it enough how important it is to always be in search for your opponent's best moves. Only so you can come to objectively correct and sound moves for yourself. In this case, if you would be in the search for your opponent's best move, you will notice that actually bishop d4 would be a blunder, because it would allow for white to win a piece. Not only that the black bishop will not have the opportunity to capture the rook on c3, in fact, by putting the bishop to d4, we put the bishop in harm's way. Why? Because white right now would play rook to e1, check, forcing the black king to the d file, and once it moves there, white is ready to pin black's bishop on d4. Of course, not with the rook on c3, which is pinned, but the other one. And even though the white rook is pinned on c3, it doesn't matter anymore, because the black bishop is stuck in a pin. It cannot capture the rook. Also, trying to play b4 using the pin would be too slow, because the rook would capture the black bishop with a check, not giving black the opportunity to capture the rook on c3. And after king moves out of the check, the white rook is ready to move away from the attack, or even the other rook capturing the b4 pawn. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this position, white has a clear material advantage, still having the queen on the board, while black no longer has it, although black has an extra rook and pawn. Generally speaking, that's far from enough compensation for a queen. However, in this case, being black to move, black actually can win the game. Now, one thing we see is that there is a pattern set up on the d file between the black rook and knight and the white queen. There is a discovered attack in the air. Again, it's quite important to be aware of our opponent's best responses. For example, if black would choose the simple knight retreat to c7, that would be a discovered attack, attacking the white rook on a6 with the knight as well as the queen. It wouldn't be the right move, as white would have the opportunity to solve both problems at the same time, namely moving the rook to d6, blocking the attack. It would be just as bad moving the knight to b4. Not because the white queen could capture it, because it cannot, because of white's back rank problem, but because of the same reason, white would just block the attack with rook d6 and maintain the material advantage. So what should black do in this position? Well, the best move right now is to move knight captures bishop on e3. What happens now is that if queen captures knight, white suffers again because of the back rank problem with rook to d1, and otherwise it is the same problem. The queen is under attack. If it moves anywhere, black will be ready to move down one of the two rooks either to d1 and f1 and either force white to give up the queen for the rook or get checkmated. Also, after rook d6, black is ready to checkmate with rook f1. Let's continue. And here we go. In this position, what we see is that white is in a check. Generally, we always recommend making sure you don't give up your right to castle. And if you're being given a check before castling, as much as you can, you try to block the check to maintain the right to castle. And that's what white did in this game, and in this particular case, it was a major mistake. Remember, all strategical elements, such as not doubling up your pawns, or keeping your pair of bishops, or even giving up your right to castle, are not a priority compared to losing material. So, in this case, white was much better off moving out of the check to e2 or even to f1 than blocking the check by moving the knight back to c3. But what's so wrong with it? The knight is sufficiently protected. White needs just one more move to castle and everything will be pretty cool. Well, the problem is that with its last move, white has just stepped in to a pin. And because of that pin, out of nowhere, the black bishop is ready to trap white's queen by playing bishop a4. The queen has nowhere safe to go, and capturing the bishop is not safe either because queen captures queen and the knight is pinned. Cannot capture the queen. White is completely lost. Make sure you always have your priorities straight, and remember, material gain or loss is certainly a priority over various strategical elements. Let's see our next example. Here we go. In this position, again we have equal material on both sides, and we can see that the black bishop has just been attacked by white's h-pawn. The bishop needs to make a decision which way to go. Well, as I keep mentioning it, always look for the tricks of your opponent, the best options of your opponent. And often so, you can avoid falling into traps. Here, what's important is to recognize that black's dark squared bishop has no moves. So therefore, you certainly need to be concerned about that bishop being attacked by a pawn. If white would get to move his pawn up from e3 to e5 or g2 to g5, that bishop indeed would be trapped. And that's why moving the bishop back to its natural square on h5 would be an immediate blunder, allowing a forceful move g4 attacking the bishop, followed by g5 trapping the other bishop. Bishop f5 would cause similar problems, with white being able to play g4 with the idea of then playing g5, although by far not as bad as moving the bishop to h5. To avoid any kind of problems and danger, the simplest solution is capturing the knight on f3. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this rook endgame, typically equal material, the game should be a draw. However, we can see the unusual positioning of both kings actually. The problem is the black king's position invites some unusual things. Try to sit back, think, and figure out how white can force a quick win in this position. And the answer is playing rook e1. Threatening of then giving a check on e5, forcing the rook interposing and then exchanging rooks and promoting the d-pawn to a queen. If right now black responds with rook g5 preventing that, white can either capture the pawn on c6 or even advance the pawn, and then after rook d5 the white king can simply walk over to the pawn as black is unable to capture the white pawn because of the checkmate with rook e5. So after rook e1, of course, the main question is, what happens if simply pawn takes pawn? Well, here comes the answer. Check, forcing the only move, rook g5, and now rook e6, threatening to checkmate. There is only one move to avoid the checkmate without losing the rook. Moving the rook to f5, poor rook has hardly any space where to move. Rook takes pawn, king g5, and now it seems that even though white won the pawn back, everything is fine for black. However, white has a very cute win right now by playing h4, which is not a checkmate because en passant, but still check, again only move for black, and voila, here is the fork, g4. What a beautiful endgame composed by Procas. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.